My name's Josh Perkins, and I look after our Field CTO organization here at Ahead. Joining me today are Pam Coffey and Andy Sajous. We're very fortunate as a group in that we get to spend time with clients across the entire country and in every industry that we serve as an organization. We wanted to spend some time today, though, discussing what we're seeing across that broad set of clients and challenges as they set out on their own organization's journeys to seek greater value and predictability from their digital investments. So today we want to focus on a key theme impacted in each of these kind of key areas across people, process, and technology. And the reality is, as we're making these kind of changes from a digital perspective, there's a lot of impact to the organization, change overall. And we're going to focus on three key themes. The first of those is that as we rethink kind of team alignment across the organization, that focus on enterprise agility needs to shift away from just the developers to larger cross-functional efforts. Two is that as we mature in the automation space in 2022, the reality is that we're going to move our focuses from kind of the build process really into how do we provide value towards the automation of process improvement. And then lastly, as we're moving from ideation into production with these type of systems, why it's even more critical than ever to make sure that we're still going through the right steps in the way that we integrate those particular changes or those improvements into our enterprise systems at scale. So what we want to start out with today is just that key theme. Rethinking our teams goes beyond the development organization, and that enterprise agility as a broader topic is incredibly crucial. So Pam, with the organizations that you're working with today that are starting to consider this kind of broader move, right, towards product alignment as a group across these cross-functional teams, have you seen them having success as they make that change or transformation across the org?
I would say it's an area, Josh, that teams are trying to grow into. And I think the key concept there is product alignment. So really being able to think of how you support the business in terms of product you're providing to the business. Your service is a product. So that kind of impacts, how do I get new feature requests for my product? How do I intake requests from my customer, my consumer? Just as if you were developing a software product, you got to figure out what new features and what capabilities and lay a plan on how you're going to deliver those. Same kind of concept here for the IT organization. So making that mind shift is a process, and I think it's a difficult process for some organizations to wrap their heads around, hey, I'm now delivering a product. There are some doing it, and I think they're doing it, those that have like a development background kind of catch on to the concept a little quicker than others.
Are you seeing kind of the idea though that like there needs to be more line of business involvement in those kind of product teams as they bake them as an org?
Exactly, Josh. I think that's a great point, because how are you going to understand what your product needs to provide, what your product needs to support, if you're not involving your consumers who are the line of business, the business area, the business unit? Every organization calls it something slightly different.
Sure. Yeah, I think we've seen in some of our customers too, this idea that like, while we need to shift towards products, maybe not everything today can be product oriented, and that they still need to think about kind of what service models need to exist foundationally as their teams too. And it seems to be a struggle in that they definitely want the advocacy portion of line of business involvement, but they also recognize that not everything is going to be this like beautifully elegant product process. And so it's got to be that like balancing act of how do they select the right products? And I think that's a huge key to that kind of maturity phase too for the organizations that I'm dealing with.
And I think that speaks to IT having a seat at the table from a strategy standpoint. Is the IT organization aware of where the business is trying to head, what the business strategy is, how that is impacting the various business units and how they're going to deliver on that strategy? So I think helping to prioritize what's the service, what's the product, what do we treat in the old way, that comes into play with our organizations as well.
Andy, I know you're really focused on like organizational change management in a lot of the projects that we've worked on. Yeah. Do you think that like this type of a change, I mean, do you think the teams are really ready with proper like OCM process behind some of this? Because I feel like messaging is really important if we're going to transform the way teams operate.
Yeah, and I think this is where I see a lot of challenges in enterprises. And one that comes to mind is an organization I work with in the Minnesota area where, you first meet with them and they feel like they've been doing Agile for 5+ years. And I think the way they organize themselves on the developer side is, they've embraced Agile methodologies and they feel like they have, some structure in place. But the more you dig into it, and Josh, to your point around that organizational shift is, ops was nowhere at the table. Whether they're promoting code and there's issues with that promotion, ops was struggling to support that. And I think to me, there's the level of empathy of understanding, what's important to ops and what's important to the developers, but more importantly, creating that alignment and not necessarily creating that segregation between developers wanting nothing to do with ops because they claim to not care. And I think to me, that's from an organizational structure change, or I'd say an organizational structure, and what we want to see them change is that embracement of bringing ops to the table, and more importantly, aligning towards what's important for the operations folks, meaning how do they support the environment long term, and more importantly, how do they support the promotion of code to be successful? And I think that's the only way organizations will be successful.
So you see that more as like a kind of moving towards like a shared responsibility model as opposed to kind of just pitching it over the fence and hoping for the best with those groups?
100%. I think that's the best way to explain it, is shared responsibility between what's important for both organizations, and then more importantly, the level of, and I keep going back to empathy, more importantly, what's creating headaches for that side of the organization. Because if you're not taking that into account, back to Pam's comment around the product management, well, then the product's going to suffer, because ideally the organization's not going to be profitable, or ideally there's going to be issues with the product. And more importantly, we kind of have to get into that mentality of supporting both sides of the house.
And Josh, you mentioned at the beginning of the question, OCM. I think one of the key tenets of OCM is helping under people. I mean, we're all people, right? Understand the why. How does it benefit me? How does it benefit Josh? How does it benefit Andy? So I think that's a key component, that sometimes we rush to do something without explaining it really well, the why behind it and how it's going to help you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And frankly, like, part of the idea of product orientation to me is getting everybody on the same page, right? Like, so that they can get to a point of self-sufficiency in their own domain expertise across all the different kind of paradigms of that particular product. And so the idea that we need all these groups kind of rowing in the same direction and thinking more myopically about how something can succeed is crucial to the success of that, right? So Andy, even to your point around like the ops team, it's not even just involvement, it's pure partnership, right? And trying to make sure that we don't promote bad code, like that we adopt more of a service level objective scenario within our development teams too, so that they feel more responsible for promoting things that work, right? And spending time on making sure that the features that they've released are functionally viable for the end consumer of that product, and not something that needs to be troubleshooted significantly after it's, in the wild. Yeah. So to that point, like, I know I'm seeing more and more of like this kind of focus across maybe some of our more mature clients in this space, where they've created fundamental like platform engineering or SRE teams as part of their organization, in the pursuit of trying to get folks more focused on, can it work? Does it work? How to ensure that things stay operable. So Pam, like, what are you seeing on the SRE side? And that's a big buzzword in the industry, but is it real? Is it working for folks?
I think a lot of companies are still trying to figure what it means to them. What does it mean as an industry standard? What does it mean when Google says it? What does it mean when XYZ company uses it? And how does that morph into their organizations? And I do see a lot of people going to other organizations and asking questions. What's working for you? What's not working? How did you structure? How did you move from point A to point B? Because you are kind of changing people's jobs, changing people who works with who. So I think, asking a lot of questions, we answer our customer questions quite a bit on our thoughts. So I think asking questions and seeing where people have been successful is what I'm seeing a lot of people do.
Yeah, I think it's a healthy balance of like extroversion and introspection too, right? It's right. What are we seeing in the industry? What are other people doing, and what can they share? But it's also a healthy dose of like realistically gauging where we are as an organization, right? Like, how are we aligned today? What are the motivations and incentives of teams to work together? And it's all of that set up properly for this shift to be successful, I think, is a really crucial piece, right? You can't expect people to change in the direction that you're hoping for them to go, unless we have a good idea of where we're sitting today and where we're trying to get from. So,
and I think Pam even hit on one point on the idea of like the target state, right? So that target state may not be optimal for every organization. And I think, Josh, the conversation I'm thinking of is one healthcare organization where, they flat out know that SRE will never work for them. They're not producing code. And I think, to me, that's where, back to Pam's comment, is the target state is going to be different for every organization, and you can't necessarily compare yourself to the Netflix of the world. I think the idea that it's going to be a little bit dynamic out there in regards to the industry by industry.
I think that's a prudent takeaway and a good point to shift. So if we kind of focused on the people part of it in terms of how are we aligning teams, then what are the next pieces is how do we make those people more effective, right, through process change? So Pam, help me understand what's kind of, where are we going and how are things kind of evolving in automation in 2022?
Yeah, so I think if you think about over the last several years, automation really focused on how do I build a server faster? And that meant how do I automate the human processes behind building a server, whether it's a virtual machine or a bare metal machine or whatever. Then that kind of morphed into how do I do that? How do I do things in the cloud faster? Because the cloud's all about fast and agility and that sort of stuff. But now it's taken on even a broader meaning and how can I take the mundane activities that my organization as a whole and that different roles within the organization are doing and optimize those? Have my people do more value added kind of stuff versus all the mundane. So because you're now taking humans and you're trying to help them take activities off their plate, sometimes that can be threatening. So it does impact people's lives. It's great, right? It impacts their lives, but we kind of see it as a positive impact. So instead of doing some mundane, fold the box and close the box over and over and over again, let a machine do that so you can go do more of the fun value add for the organization kind of activities. And I know, Andy, you're big in this space as well and have some thoughts.
And I'd say, Pam, just kind of to complete what you said there in regards to the idea that organizations are now looking at how do we, I'd say, take mundane tasks off our plate, is the idea that when we first met with a lot of customers, let's just say 5 years ago around automation, there's this maturity curve that we talked through around creating, unique services back to the business, creating self-service catalogs, and the idea that, it takes time to build upon that. And I think what I've seen in the past 18 to 24 months is the idea that organizations are now embracing the idea that they don't have to create this private cloud with service catalogs. And again, that's the target state and that's where we want to be. And I'm not negating that. But I think the idea that organizations are now leveraging common tool sets to just make their lives easier. And I'd say operations folks are seeing the value. And I think, Pam, to your point, I think the more that we see operations folks embrace it, they start to see the value of, okay, well, whether it's network changes or maybe some security remediation, the idea that I can do small mundane tasks and essentially automate some of that. And it doesn't have to have a shiny, front end catalog. The idea that they're just going to leverage the tools to do that, I think it just makes their lives, day-to-day lives, easier. And I think that's what I'm seeing proliferate in the past, I'd say 18 to 24 months.
I think too, the idea that how we thought of serializing the incremental improvement in automation no longer marries to the speed of change desired by organizations, right? So this idea that we're just going to get a small hint better at providing or provisioning something for someone to consume isn't meeting the overarching needs of what the business is really asking for. And so as we see people kind of shifting focus towards how do I look at process improvement as an opportunity for automation, right? Yes. How do I look at workflows in an area as a mechanism to automate those processes? How do we evaluate processes as to whether or not they're good or bad? Because frankly, we don't want to automate bad process within an environment either. It's just a completely different game. But the reality, I think, to the key point there too, is that a lot of this is just about mission alignment. Like, how can I get more of my people doing things that matter, that are unique to my organization, and that provide value back to the customers of my organization? And I look at, we have a large kind of emerging automotive manufacturer, and they're thinking about everything as an opportunity for automation, whether that's the IT space or the OT space makes absolutely no difference for them. Anything that they're going to do more than once is an opportunity for evaluation as to whether or not they should automate it as a team. And one of the bigger challenges they're seeing in that space is how do they buy the time for their folks to get better at automating things? And so they need to get rid of the manual tasks just to buy the time budget necessary, right, to hone the skills across the organization to be able to contribute to that upstream need to automate as much as humanly possible.
I think there's a hidden benefit there that a lot of people don't think about oftentimes. If you automate a workflow or automate a process, then you understand that workflow and you understand that process. So it forces you to go through that level of detail. Now you can start collecting metrics around that process and see how can you continuously improve it and how can you tweak it to make it better, make it faster, or whatever. So I think that's kind of a hidden benefit of this whole topic.
I think the other one that comes up a lot for us is the concept of auditability and security in automation.
Yeah.
Which is, again, if I know a process, if I've created consistency around a process and I create auditability to a process, I've inherently improved the security posture of that process as a side effect, right? And
we're not even talking about bringing new people into the fold because we're all doing a lot of hiring right now, right? So if you have a documented, automated process, new people are going to learn a bit faster of how to integrate into the organization.
Absolutely.
Well, Josh, question for you. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
No, please.
Yeah. What do you think the impact of the hyperscalers have had on this whole automation topic, if any?
I think it's been a pretty tremendous acceleration, right, in terms of exposing even more diverse teams of consumers of IT platforms to the potential of automation. So, I think Andy made the point around like private cloud and how we were trying to provide access and service catalogs. Well, they get that in day one in the hyperscalers, right? Like they have access to very robust service catalogs and APIs just by virtue of participating. And so that's creating a level of urgency in my mind for internal IT teams to try to synthesize similar experiences on their own internal platforms, or recognize that platform shouldn't exist because it's an encumbrance to that, time to delivery or speed that we kind of mentioned at the front end. And so if anything, it's this amazing crash course for people to say, well, I didn't know if that was possible, but Amazon just showed us that it was, right, across a diverse set of features or functionality. And now we need to do better, right? We need to be better. We need to be faster. And so I think a lot of the lessons for my customers that they're getting from the hyperscalers is like, even if we believe that these workloads maybe shouldn't exist in that space or aren't meant to live in that world, the tenets of operating in that space should live in our internal ecosystem. Yep. And they need to spend more and more time, investing in the tools and the frameworks that are similar to what the hyperscalers are doing so that experience is consistent with the internal IT operations. I think a perfect example of that is the proliferation of infrastructure as code, right? I think that was a pipe dream for a lot of people early on. And then we saw cloud formation and ARM templates and all this really just show people in a very simplistic way the potential of that being integrated into their workflows. And so to me, while we went from we're going to have different tools internal and then we're going to have the tools that we access in the hyperscalers, I think we're going to see a convergence of those platforms over time. And we need just fundamentally to approach the assembly of things in an automated fashion differently. And the hyperscalers taught that to us really, really quickly.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, this even goes back to the people shift, right? So the idea that when you think of infrastructure as code, the idea that maybe organizations have never worked in environments that are solely infrastructure as code. And that's something that we challenge a lot of our clients that are going into cloud is the idea that they're not going to go into the cloud portal every day. If anything, they're going to make manipulation through infrastructure as code. And I think, to Josh, to your point, the idea that they're doing it on a day-to-day basis, or at least they're seeing the value of being able to replicate environments through, I'd say, standard deployments through the code that they maintain, then they start to ask more from their on-prem infrastructure. So, Josh, to your point, the idea that there's the proliferation of tools like Terraform and stuff like that, and they start asking themselves, could they do this on-prem? Or more importantly, could their infrastructure do this on-prem, or should they be embracing some of the principles that they're doing in cloud? And I think, to your point, it's accelerating it. I think we're seeing operational folks embrace it, and then more importantly, asking more for their on-prem infrastructure.
I think the last piece of that too that's really interesting to me is I think we focused automation a lot on the build process, but not the reclamation process.
Mhm.
And so the cloud has taught us through punitive financial instrumentation that leaving stuff running that we don't need is expensive. And when we were doing that in kind of internal infrastructure and it was a sunken cost for the organization, there wasn't a lot of visibility to those things, right? We accepted a level of inefficiency in those scenarios to make it easy to deal with, right? But the cloud, obviously, we don't do it that way. And so some of these tools are needed just to make sure that we can automate the decommissioning of resources as well in an efficient manner. And hopefully the side effect of that is we start doing that better in our own internal systems as well. And we free up or liberate all this captured capacity that we've been using ineffectively for a long period of time. And that makes the balance, right, of the effective use of resources internally catch up to the elastic, kind of promise of where we are with hyperscale clouds.
That's a great point, Josh. So if we think about workflows, right? Workflows in the organization, perhaps across parts of the organization, how is that kind of changing the idea of automation?
Yeah.
And how are IT shops kind of jumping in on that transition?
Yeah, and I could take this one first. So I think for me, what I see is a lot of organizations embracing the process workflow, and this goes back to the idea of the process change, and with organizations leveraging tools like ServiceNow, or we see a lot of RPA technologies emerging out there. We're now seeing the finance part of the business embrace some of the process workflows, or I'd say we're seeing HR as well as customer service management. So different modules within ServiceNow embracing the approval process, but more importantly, the internal business process. And how is IT enabling that? Obviously, the tools that I was talking through, whether it's RPA technologies or through ServiceNow, the ability for organizations to even think in that manner. And I say that contextually from the idea that many organizations didn't see the value or I would say the power of the platform of something like ServiceNow. And we've now made that shift where I think from a business side, organizations are saying, okay, well, we can't be managing this stuff in complex worksheets anymore. The idea that we have the ability to automate and maybe even automate approvals, or more importantly, simplify the approval process for just, I'd say, mundane business tasks, has nothing to do from an IT provisioning perspective. It has the ability to leverage the tools that IT is providing back to the business.
I think it's a great point, Andy. And if I think about the other power of doing that on a ServiceNow type platform is you can now tie it to a business service or a business function, an application service. So there's that whole taxonomy of trying to figure out how am I supporting my customer, my business, and then what flows under that. And then the workflows all integrate with that knowledge, that knowledge of the mapping of the environment. It's kind of a key component that a lot of customers are starting to take advantage of.
Yeah, okay.
I think the proliferation too is a side effect of creating visual tool sets, right? Like the reality is we've made modeling and building workflows around business process easier over the last 5 to 10 years, which has proliferated the ability of non-technical teams to take advantage of that kind of workflow tool set and workflow arbitration. And so we're starting to see more of that kind of democratize across the enterprise, because they feel confident in their ability to build those visual workflows, explain those out, and map and integrate them to other teams. I think the beauty of these platforms too is that you can have a relatively non-technical person in accounting leveraging the basis of workflows they've seen in the finance group and working kind of collectively to create joins and changes and kind of take a more end-to-end approach in the way business process works. And so, I think we're going to very, very readily see kind of this significant uptick in the use of workflows, as opposed to the amount of scripting it takes to get basic like automation done outside of those low-level IT abstractions. As this is just far more meaningful for most people living day to day in the enterprise.
I know one thing that I hear has been a very hot topic here lately around workflows and this whole thing is how can I get more out of my observability stack? And if I do get more visibility and early access to a brewing problem before it becomes an outage, how do I automate my response to that, even if it's just getting the right payload of information to the right person? kind of brings us to our next question, dovetails. We hear a lot about AI ops, and it's been around for a while, right? But what can we realistically accomplish with that, and how does all this kind of fit in with that?
Pam, I think I could take that one. So if you think about it from an AI, and I'm going to answer this in two ways. One is, what can we realistically do? And I think the idea that when people think AI ops, they think the idea that there's going to be some level of AI remediation that goes into your environment. And I'm not saying every organization is ready for that, meaning automated responses to certain events that allow us to remediate that environment. And usually that creates a little bit of heartburn for most organizations. For me, I think the idea is, could I create an event that then allows me to automate maybe discovery? So could I enrich the service ticket that I'm creating? Could I go from let's just say a network switch and pull, I would say, dynamic information that populates into the service ticket so that the level 1, level 2 engineer can actually respond appropriately and maybe reduce the time to remediation? There's that level of AI ops. And then secondarily, the idea that can we marry correlation? So we get a lot of noise from, I'd say, our observability stack. And I say that because maybe every different silo or every different group within the organization has their own sets of tools. Could we drive correlation? So some level of event management through, I would say, an AI stack that allows us to correlate the events, and then more importantly, drive that and automate the ticket creation within my ITSM platform. If you can do that, I think that's a realistic goal to go from my tool sets, which is going to be a multitude of platforms, into some level of event management, then into my ITSM platform. I think there's huge advantages of just doing that and driving correlation between the various events. And I think when people think of AI ops, they think of this a lofty goal of automated responses. More importantly, could we just leverage AI to drive a correlation?
And I don't think that's a heavy lift in a lot of orgs either. I think that's one of the key takeaways for me is that, the two things that you're describing aren't build, right? They're buy scenarios in most orgs today, which is to say, the tools that they choose, the platforms that they adopt are starting to build this type of capability, this type of machine learning backend into the way that they deal with data. And even platforms like the ITSM platforms that they're using are investing in spaces to try to mine process information or correlation from kind of the data that they're seeing inbound. And so for me, it's like, are you making the right kind of choices as you're building these platforms out, as you're looking to instrument kind of the custom digital assets that you guys are putting into your environments? Are you selecting tools or creating a preference for tools that have that type of mindset in mind, right? This journey towards AI ops as a component of their kind of vision for the future of that instrumentation. I think that's really key too, is like, this isn't something where it's just going to be, you have to develop AI as an organization.
Yeah. Well, Josh, there are many silos in an organization that might be impacted by what you just said, and Andy, what you said, right? Like, can we correlate across all these tools? Some might be database tools, some might be, different orgs, different parts of the organization. So what do you see customers do about that, or what do you do about that?
I mean, I think it starts with, I think we've mentioned it a couple other times, but it starts with an accounting of where you are, right? So I think the idea of there being multiple silos is obviously, pretty realistic for the large enterprise customers that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, like how things have come into fruition. But the reality of that is, like, we have to create a baseline understanding of where kind of all those tools are, how they're kind of looking into those environments. And then we can start mapping out kind of directionally across that org what the life cycle is for those things, right? How they need to integrate together, where there's commonality in terms of approaches. And I think the key there is that you're not looking to devalue the selection that anyone's made, right, in any particular silo, but instead like up level or uplift kind of the efforts that they're making in their space so that there's more coordination, right? Everything that we're talking about is to break down the silo, right? Is to create teams of people working across those functions and focusing on the top level mission of what they're trying to accomplish, not necessarily like the rudimentary components of their particular area. And so I think some of it is, can we communicate a good vision? And the other is, can we be realistic about where we are today so that we can start aligning that vision for where we want to go and the steps needed to get us there?
So if an organization kind of is good at server builds, basic server builds, they've automated that, And now they want to move that next step to really automating better process improvement, taking those workflows that we've been talking about. What are you seeing our customers do to make that leap? Either one of you.
I think for me, this goes back to the previous comment that I made around the idea that even if I think about server provisioning, that still is a lofty task. And so I think for me, it's the shift from, even back to the previous story I was telling you, it's that shift from going into focusing on what are the more mundane tasks that are affecting the operational folks, not necessarily concerned about, the services we're providing back to the back end business. Now that's still a goal, I think, long term, and I think that's where organizations want to get to. And I think even managing their infrastructure as code to do that, it will help kind of service that. But I think ultimately where I think organizations can get to is the idea that, attack the low hanging fruit first. Go for the easier processes to I would say remove from their day-to-day operations.
I would just add, I think, on the other side of that coin, I think most mature organizations in this space have started to realize that it takes an army of people thinking about these things to make meaningful impact, right? The slow, subtle, incremental improvement approach certainly helps from helping IT build and sustain enterprise scale solutions that the other people can take advantage of. But real, meaningful impact around process improvement can't start with the IT work in most situations, right? It has to start with the people that are proximal to the inefficiencies in the process. And so, I'm seeing a lot more teams start adopting low code and no code platforms to build apps, but apps is really a euphemism for flows, right? In most situations, right? Or improved business process mapping, or collaboration points with other teams. And so to me, part of this is just saying, we still need to improve a lot of the stuff that we do in IT and make that more digestible and consumable by the consumers of that within the org. But part of it is empowering those teams with self-service and self-sufficiency with new tools and new platforms, because that rising tide will raise all boats way faster than presenting a server build process to a development team quickly, right? It's a totally different approach. And I think most organizations realize they have to get better at both if they want to continue to proceed.
I think that's perfect segue into our next topic. I believe, Andy, you were going to kick that up.
So obviously we talked about people, we talked about process. So I think that last pillar is more focused on the technology piece. And I take this from the idea of, okay, organizations are creating conceptually new concepts, and they have this shifting from ideation to production. So meaning we take an innovative idea and we want to actually move this to prod. What are the critical requirements to the enterprise to do these types of integration? So Pam, I think I want to start with you on the first question. So with observability, or OAC, our buzzwords today, what are our clients really doing?
I think we talked a little bit about it in the previous section from the observability standpoint, right? Let's make sure we can automate what we're getting from that stack. But I think we take it a little bit further. If you think about mature organizations that want to do continuous deployments, they want to move to production deployments using a code approach, pipeline approach. You have to know something about how that system is behaving before you go ahead and send that off to production, or you have to catch it very early if it's behaving inappropriately, so that the developers now own that, right? They own the development of the code, the deployment of the code, and if it has an issue. So I think those very mature organizations that are looking to do continuous deployments are looking very hard at observability as code and picking vendors that fit into that space that embed well into their automation pipelines, if you will.
Great.
I think they're also looking at it from the perspective of what can they take out of those observability platforms from a real world perspective, and then automate downstream impact to, right? So how do we become more responsive based on what's being observed? And I think, obviously instrumentation is the starting point, like making sure that when we deploy code, it's properly instrumented to the extent that we understand what's happening with it. Like that's obviously step one. And then step two is how can we become better at, once we recognize something going on in that, something that we've promoted in that particular space, what are the actual steps needed to be responsive in the real world scenario to make sure that we don't have a performance impact or customer experience impact, right, as a side effect of whatever got promoted.
So that actually leads into the next question that I have, and this is obviously we're talking about the proliferation of new tools in regards to obviously ServiceNow being a core platform of that. If we think of many organizations saying our ESM team appears to really get in the way of development teams, how are others addressing this friction? Now, I'll throw this question out to either Pam or Josh. I mean, how are you seeing other organizations solve for this?
I think the first thing that I see is automate change management. You still need to have some governance and some policies around change in the environment, but you don't want to slow things down, but you still want the tracking and the metrics. So I think that's the number one thing it's low-hanging fruit. Let's just use the APIs. Let's automate change management. Let's get a culture and an organization that's okay with automating change management. That's the first thing I see happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'd 100% agree. I think trying to make the integration process as frictionless as possible is key, right? I don't want developers thinking about the ESM platform, right? I want them to be enabled to follow best practice as we've defined for the enterprise through those systems inherently in their build process or code development process. And so, I think what we're seeing is embracing as many of the integration points, plugins, and APIs humanly possible to make those embedded for one and seamless as possible. Secondly, is really the key there. If I have developers complaining that the ESM platform is somehow an encumbrance to their work, it's probably because we haven't integrated it properly or to the extent it should be at this point for them to functionally use it. So interesting about the next question we have teed up in regards to change management, and Pam hit on this in regards to, okay, if I have to integrate this with change management, I still need to track my assets that are within the public cloud. So if my developers are provisioning assets in the public cloud, how am I tracking these assets? And what do you guys see other organizations doing to do this?
I think it kind of goes back to what does it make sense to track and making that decision first. If you think of something, containers or microservices, and they're very ephemeral, and do you track each little microservice? Probably not. Do you understand the business service, the business capability that environment is supporting? And maybe you track something that rolls up in a more sane way to that business service or business capability. I think organizations need help deciding that. And I think, there's a multiple ways of doing that. Once you make that decision, you can tag assets, you can do, tag-based discoveries, there's all kinds of things you can do from a technology standpoint, but making that decision about what needs to be tracked and how do I align it to what I'm servicing the business with is I think the first step.
Yeah. I mean, having access to a near infinite pool of diverse resources makes it more crucial than ever for good hygiene, right, in this circumstance. And I think that the good part here, as we've kind of mentioned in other sections, is that there's visibility from a cost perspective in inefficiencies in this space. And so there's a preponderance of pressure from the organization to make sure when this doesn't go well, it gets rectified rather quickly. And so I think it's a circumstance where, one, if you can start from the very beginning with an appropriate operating model and the governance, right, in those environments to make sure that you're following good hygiene, that will serve the organization well. But for most organizations that have kind of tiptoed in different aspects or different organizations consuming these, it's really, can we really quickly get to a point where these things are properly integrated the way we would identify and account for any other asset we have in the environment, because they are any other asset, right? They just live in another data center. Right, somewhere else. So I think that's a really crucial piece for anyone that's trying to figure out how do they kind of wrangle that moving forward. Yeah. With that,
we're about out of time here. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah. No, plenty more we could talk about, but obviously want to thank everyone for attending our session today. Next up in the summit, we have Rob Corey, Matt Sweetnam, and Johnny Hatch presenting their session, Data Talks, BS Walks, Business in the Age of Smart Analytics. So stay tuned for that session, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.